Cool. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming here. We're really delighted to be hosting Dr. Hunnes to talk about her new book, Recipe for Survival. So this event is hosted by the University of San Diego Food Studies Initiative, pasting a link to a little bit more information about us. In essence, I would say, the Food Studies Initiative at USD is trying practically to create we're very much on the way to create a minor in food studies, but the real kind of driving energy of the Food Studies Initiative is a kind of justice-oriented approach to thinking about food, where we're centering issues like racial justice, environmental justice, animal protection, and the various other kind of issues associated with food that shape our lives. And of course, one of the biggest issues is the question of climate change. And we're really lucky to have Dr. Hunnes with us as a real expert in this. So I'll just say a little bit to introduce her and then hand it over. We first met when we were, I forgot what the synagogue was, but it was some kind of local synagogue that invited both of us to speak, about these issues. So I first kind of met Dr. Hunnes in the community, in my Jewish community, and then was, really impressed with the way she articulated very kind of forcefully what's wrong with the current kind of situation we're facing, but also how much we can do, how able we are to actually do things in our lives that would make a difference. And I just really can't recommend highly enough her new book, Recipe for Survival. So Dr. Hunnes is an environmentalist, is a dietitian, is bringing that kind of expertise to this discussion. And one of the things that particularly impressed me about your book was that you caught the attention of Dr. Colin Campbell, the famous biochemist and nutrition kind of expert who helped conduct the China studies and then wrote about these kind of really epic nutritional studies. And this is what he has to say about your book. He says it's a brilliantly written book which could become a classic. It is the ticket to our future. It is without parallel. It is well nigh time for us to truly sense the future of our children and our grandchildren. You've got a lot to live up to in your presentation here, but let me hand it over to you. And folks, we'll have about a half an hour presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And I want to invite folks, anytime a question occurs to you, feel free to send it to me directly in chat, and I will bring those questions up when we have time for Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I actually was very fortunate, and I had Colin Campbell at Cornell, and I took his vegetarian nutrition course, which is actually the reason I became vegan plant-based the first time around for health reasons. And then once I started learning all about the environmental aspects about it, I was like, oh, well, here's a double down reason to continue this plant-based. And of course, for the animals and all of that other stuff that you also talk about in, your research and your passion as well. So I've been very fortunate to, I guess, now call Colin Campbell a friend of mine. So he and I have been emailing, and same with you. So before I begin, I just want to quickly paste this survey into the chat. You don't have to take it now, but perhaps towards the very end or right before we log off. It's just a quick survey to kind of get a bearing of what do you already know about climate change and nutrition and those types of things from your age perspective. So I'll share my screen. All right. Presentation mode. Okay, there we go. All right, so it's called Recipe for Survival, What You Can Do to Live a Healthier and More Environmentally Friendly Life. And I just want to start off by saying that in August, February, and April of this past, calendar year, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with reports and basically have said the effects of climate change are outpacing our ability to adapt. This is a code red for humanity. There will be more extinctions. Each 0.1 degree Celsius matters. And it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. This is fact. And then Antonio Guterres has recently said, we are at a crossroads. This is the time for action. We have the tools and know-how required to limit warming and secure a livable future. So I just want to keep that in the back of your minds. And I'll preface the talk with the idea of, if Earth were a person, we would do everything possible to save her. Yet too often humans do not treat Earth and the species that live here as though there is a desperate need for life support. Instead, we continue to harm Earth with more toxins from agricultural fertilizers, pesticides, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases. We tear down Earth's cleansing mechanisms such as trees, algae, and phytoplankton, and we dehydrate Earth by pumping out too much water to feed the animals that humans want to eat. If Earth were a human, we have kind of failed her, but we can change that, and here's how. I'm going to talk about that in the second half of my talk. Some key thoughts and takeaways is that our choices produce a lot of greenhouse gases. Our survival and the survival of other species depends on us. Halting and reversing climate change feels really daunting. Like, how can I, one little person, make a difference? But your choices do matter. What you eat is the single most impactful thing you as an individual do every single day. And hope does live. We must be part of the solution, not continue to add to the problem. I always love this quote from Albert Einstein: "Nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet." I mean, to know that back when he was still alive is quite amazing in my mind. The reason this is so important is because agriculture accounts for roughly 25% of all greenhouse gases globally. That's around 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents every year. And 84% of this comes from animals. On the graphic on the right, I've circled the 39% from enteric fermentation and the 45% from manure excreted and applied to soil as where that 84% is coming from. And enteric fermentation and the production of feed, including deforestation, also accounts for a large portion of this. Why is this such a problem? Well, because the current world population is 7.9 billion people. And in the United States, we average roughly 200 pounds per person per year of animal product intake. In developing countries, it's only about 62 pounds per person per year. But by 2100, we're expected to have roughly 11 billion people. And there are estimates saying we need to produce 38% more food to feed all these people and around 62 to 70% more meat. That's a lot. Food already uses half of all the ice-free land in the world to produce, but the other half of the land is too dry, too cold, or already too built up and populated. And we do not have a planet B. So basically, emissions from agriculture are likely to increase and produce more greenhouse gases as other other sectors reduce their greenhouse gases. So if you look at the graphic on the left, which is 2014, and a possible future scenario where we've reduced our greenhouse gases from electricity and heat production or other energy or even industry and transportation, you see that, oh, it's probably going to increase from agriculture. So how do we get more land? Unfortunately, most likely deforestation. Now, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, are, in my mind, one of the worst things that humans have developed. Basically, 80% of all antibiotic use occurs on farms such as this. By 2030, antibiotic use on farms will increase 69% around the world because of this increased meat consumption I was just talking about. And this also increases the risk of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and also the risk for new and emerging infectious diseases. In fact, it's estimated that 3 out of every 4 new infectious emerging disease, such as COVID or things like that, will likely come from animals. And then, of course, you have agricultural waste and dead zones. So the pollution from these farms ends up going into streams and then rivers and then polluting the fresh marine waters, which you see here with this cloud-like substance that can lead to dead zones where there's so much carbon and so much waste and nitrogen in the water that it removes and disallows oxygen to continue to be there, which actually kills off a lot of the animals. And then, of course, there's food waste. A lot of us waste, unfortunately, too much food. Globally, around 1/3 of all food is wasted, and that's 40% of food in the United States. And it produces 3.3 gigatons of carbon every single year, primarily from methane when it ends up in the landfill. And if you can see on the graph below, If food waste were a country, now granted it's not, but if it were, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the United States. And one of the reasons this is a huge problem is because not only is it wasting a lot of food that could go to be feeding other people, but it also wastes precious water, land, other inputs that have gone into growing those foods. So it really is a big waste of, a lot of resources. Only 3% of water on Earth is fresh water, and agriculture uses about 70% of that. I'm asked a lot, can fish actually be sustainable? My researched opinion is no, because nearly 90% of fish stocks are already fully exploited or overfished. And so when a fish stock is fully exploited, that means you can't take out any additional and have it still be sustainable. Currently, only about 6% of fish stocks are underfished. In 2013, that number was 10%. So we've gotten worse, not better, at managing our fisheries. In 2016, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations had a report, and it said, From Fish to 2030, that was the title of the report. It said, supplying fish sustainably, producing it without depleting productive natural resources and without damaging the precious aquatic environment is a huge challenge. We continue to see excessive and irresponsible harvesting in the capture fisheries and in aquaculture. Today, several fish species have been declared critically endangered and threatened with extinction by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. And these include certain bluefin tuna, grouper, and swordfish populations, and the Patagonian toothfish, which you may have heard of as the Chilean sea bass. So how does overfishing occur? Primarily from fishing methods, including bottom trawling, where a ship is pulling a big, huge net across the bottom of the ocean floor. Purse seine nets are a little bit like a big net that goes around a school of fish, and then you cinch it at the top and pull up everything that is with it. Gill nets are a curtain of netting that a fish or some other marine animal might swim into, and it can't get out, it's stuck. And then long lining is miles of baited hooks, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of baited hooks. And again, any animal can, try to eat that bait, and then it gets stuck in the hook. Illegal fishing is another way, where you have countries sending their fleets to another location, such as off the coast of Africa, where they really do need that fish to meet some of their protein needs. And then they're fishing those waters and taking the fish away from the people who need it there. And then there's low efficiency aquaculture, which is where you're feeding a high amount of fish product into the system, but you're only getting maybe a pound of fish out. And there's a short video that explains and provides a lot of the imagery to explain this. And it's only about a 4-minute video.
The Earth. There are currently 7 billion people living on 30% of its surface, and all of them are dependent on the remaining 70%, the ocean. The ocean is the largest source of food in the world. Fish is the main daily source of protein for 1.2 billion people. But fishers are more and more frequently returning home with empty nets. Let's turn the clock back a little. Some scientists say that in the last 60 years, stocks of large fish have fallen by 90%. They are warning that we are facing the collapse of all types of fish species in less than 50 years. The reason for this? Overfishing. Longline fishing vessels deploy 1.4 billion hooks a year. 1.4 billion hooks, each with a slice of fish hanging from them as bait. There are trawling vessels that cast nets with an opening of up to 23,000 meters squared, the size of 4 football pitches, and big enough to hold 13 jumbo jets, or more commonly, more than 500 tons of fish. Amongst these 500 tons of fish, there is a lot of bycatch. Bycatch is marine creatures incidentally caught. often at large quantity. Typically, shrimp trawlers throw 80 to 90% of the marine creatures caught back overboard. This means that for 1 kilo of shrimp, up to 9 kilos of other marine wildlife is caught and wasted. To relieve the strain on wild fish, 47% of our seafood demand is farmed fish. But marine aquaculture is more of a nail in a coffin than a lifeline. Many of the farmed fish are carnivorous. That is, they eat other smaller fish. 5 kilos of captured wild fish are needed to produce 1 kilo of farm-reared salmon. Aquaculture just converts low-value small fish into higher-value bigger ones. It does not create more fish. The majority of European fish stocks are overfished. Historically, EU fisheries ministers have set fishing limits exceeding scientific advice. In 2008, fishing limits were defined for the highly prized bluefin tuna. Scientists recommended a fishing limit of 10,000 tons to rebuild the increasingly depleted population. However, the EU and other fishing nations decided on a fishing limit of 29,500 tons, 3 times what scientists had suggested. Then, despite this already inflated limit, 61,000 tons of bluefin tuna were caught. That is 6 times more than the recommended limit. Billions of euro in public subsidies are fueling this overfishing. If this continues, soon there will be no fish left. How do we end overfishing? Your politicians have the responsibility for making the decisions in Brussels that will end overfishing.
Okay. And the same thing in the US. We have, rules and laws here and organizations that are making these suggestions. And the reason I call attention to that is even though they're still able to catch more than is the recommended amount, a lot of the fish that they're catching are younger or smaller, maybe haven't spawned yet. And so that will have knock-on effects down the line. So that's one of the reasons I do call attention to that. So they did talk about it a bit in the film, the very brief film, but, I call it CAFO-like aquaculture. And then there are issues with that, of course, from environmental pollution, from drugs and other chemicals that they're feeding these fish to try to keep them healthy. Unfortunately, there is still spread of disease and parasites from these very confined fish to wild fish because they're sharing that marine environment. The entanglement of predators, it's quite likely that a shark or other predator is not familiar with nets. So they don't know that there's a net there. All they see is a big school of fish, and then they get caught and can't escape. The use of wild fish as fish feed, they do talk about that in the film a bit, but how we're taking tons and tons of smaller fish to feed these mostly carnivorous fish to produce fish that people want to actually eat. And then escaped fish sometimes will compete with wild fish for food and habitat, and that can really affect the wild habitat that these other fish are living in. And then pollution and waste from the captive fish because they're in the same environment, and that can create issues for the wildlife as well. I'm asked a lot, because I'm a dietitian, about concerns of protein. So many people are concerned on a plant-based diet that they're not going to get enough protein. I think that is the most frequently asked question I am asked. And really, your average healthy woman only needs about 50 grams of protein per day, and your average healthy man only needs about 70 grams of protein per day. So a lot less than we think we need, or we've been told we need, from workout people or fitness gurus, things like that. And, when you're looking at 100 grams of food and you're comparing animal-based foods with plant foods, in reality, there are so many plant-based foods that have just as much protein in them as as animal-based foods. So I am not concerned at all about getting enough protein on a plant-based diet. I've been plant-based for 21 years and have never had a doctor bring a concern that I am protein deficient or anything like that. Another issue I like to talk about in my book is plastic, because we use so much plastic. Modern plastics were developed in 1907, commercialized in the 1930s and 40s during World War II. By 1950, plastic production reached about 1.7 million tons per year, but today it's more than 300 million tons per year. So that's more than a 200-fold increase in 70 years, but global population has only increased about 5 times in that same period. So I don't know what we're all doing with all this extra plastic, but it's everywhere. Look in front of you, and you probably have some in front of you right now. It's used in all types of consumer products, and plastics, unfortunately, are made from oil, natural gas, and other petroleum-derived products. The problem with plastic is that it persists in the environment for hundreds or thousands of years. I'm not sure we really know for sure. And about 1.1 to 8.8 million metric tons end up in the oceans every single year as a result of mismanagement at the coastal waste at landfill. It ends up in the water. And so when it ends up in the oceans, it doesn't biodegrade. They may photodegrade by the UV hitting the chemical bonds, but then they just turn into microplastics. So they don't really disappear. And this is what it unfortunately looks like. It can damage marine ecosystems, including coral reefs. It can entangle and drown animals. It can get consumed by animals and release toxins or persistent organic pollutants, POPs, into their bloodstream, which bioaccumulates up the food chain by way of, accumulates in their fat. And so when other animals are eating the smaller animals, it does accumulate even further. And eventually, when humans eat fish or other marine creatures that have some of these chemicals in them, we consume them as well. In fact, 93% of Americans have been found with BPA residue in their blood. And of course, there's unnecessary use of plastic. Bananas come in their own packaging naturally, so I'm not sure why these bananas need to have the extra plastic on them. And then these are just some selected persistent organic pollutants and some of the known health effects on the body. They can include fetal or reproductive dysfunction. A lot of them are possible carcinogens, immune or skin and liver dysfunction, behavioral or nervous system, so the brain function, and of course endocrine, because a lot of these are actually hormone mimics. So how much plastic do we all use on average? Around 300 single-use plastic bags every year, 200 single-use plastic bottles, and unfortunately, only 9% of all plastics ever get recycled. And I'm sure, speaking with students, you're all really good about this. I see a lot of students, at least at UCLA, they're constantly walking around with these reusable water bottles. And everything's in a backpack. So I know students are really aware of this. So good job, but still, just as a reminder, only 9% of plastics get recycled every year. And even that is a little bit of a misnomer, because a lot of them get downcycled into other products like park benches or flooring or clothing. Palm oil is another issue I talk about because it just kind of breaks my heart. It's in so many foods, but it results in the clear cutting of forests in Indonesia and Malaysia for the palm oil plantations. It's a driver of human-induced climate change, and it destroys the habitats of orangutans, Asian elephants, and Sumatran rhinos who are native to these areas. Unfortunately, 20 companies are primarily responsible for this deforestation, and that's the image on the left. About 50% of all packaged foods contain palm oil, and it's not often called palm oil. It can be called something else, and it can also be used in a lot of other products like detergents and soaps. And so as you see on the graphic on the right, our appetite for palm oil has actually almost doubled from 2007, 2008 to 2020, 2021. And as we're cutting down forests to make more room for palm oil plantations, we're cutting down the homes of some of the species I mentioned, like this orangutan. And why do I talk about this? Why is this important? And to me, it's very important to recognize that the more biological diversity there is on the planet, the more resilient the planet is as a whole. If you think about monocultures, when you're only growing one type of crop or one type of animal that you're raising, if there's a disease that comes into that flock or into that herd or into that crop, and it's one species, you could lose that whole entire species in that, in that one infection. But if you have a large mixture, it just makes them that much more resilient. You have a barrier that could stop the spread of those diseases. So that's why it's so important. And if you look at the graphs in 1900, if you're looking at global terrestrial mammal biomass, and this is very similar for all terrestrial biomass, humans were about 1/6 in 1900, livestock were about 2/3, and then wild animals were about 1/6. And if you fast forward to 2000, it's gotten even worse now. Livestock is about 80% of global terrestrial mammal biomass. Humans, almost a quarter, which only leaves that little small slice for the wildlife. And yet, when you look at where all that biological diversity is, it's pretty much in all the wildlife. So we're really doing a lot of harm when we are destroying biological diversity. So finally, on to the positive, and then most of the Q&A, I'm happy to address more of the positive and more of the how-to. But for sure, I want to talk about some of the positive. Be an informed consumer. Try to eat more plants and crowd out the meat. Vegan and plant-based diets can grow as much as 1,000 times more calories on 1 acre of land as growing an animal. And, we have a balcony. We don't have a house with a backyard, and we grow some of our own crops on our balcony, which I think is really fun to do, like these tomatoes in the picture. And then just as a quick reminder, animal-based foods, are significantly more resource intensive than plant-based foods are. And particularly for beef, that's honestly the worst. But for the most part, plant-based foods use less land, less water, and produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions than animal products. Look out for palm oil, skip fish oil, and choose plant-based omega-3s instead. There is so much research out there now indicating that the idea of a fish oil supplement it doesn't react in the body the way we thought it might, because the consumption of fish in the Mediterranean areas, for example, was associated with better health. But fish oil on its own doesn't show that association at all. So I strongly recommend taking, foods that have alpha-linolenic acid in them, which is like walnut, chia, or flax. Get it straight from the source. If you really want that DHA and EPA directly, you can get it from algae, which is the primary producer. In fact, that's where fish get their DHA and EPA from. They don't produce it on their own. They get it from algae or the smaller animals that they have eaten, the algae. So we can produce DHA and EPA on our own from ALA. Whenever possible, use multi-use products such as bags, coffee mugs, bottles, etc., instead of the single-use products. And yes, that is my son when he was a little younger on the bag. Create less food waste. Buy only what you will eat, compost what you cannot, save leftovers for later with canning or jarring or freezing. That's something we like to do in our house. We're not so great with the canning and jarring. We still need to continue working on our skills with that, but we do a lot of freezing of leftovers. And then repurpose. We turn a lot of leftovers into new recooked recipes. For example, we recently made pesto. We don't put cheese in our pesto. We put the nutritional yeast instead. But when that was close to the end of its life, I made a soup. And then instead of cutting new garlic and new basil, I just put the leftovers in. Use less packaging. Buy in bulk. Shop at farmers markets. Look into CSAs, which is community supported agriculture, and community gardens. And again, this is our community garden up at UCLA campus. We are fortunate to have this wonderful resource. And then reduce, reuse, and recycle whenever possible. Refuse the plastic, reuse what you can, and recycle what's left. And also be mindful of the types of clothing and textiles you buy, because it's actually the third most detrimental industry after fossil fuels and plastics. A lot of clothes today are made from plastic or petrochemical products, such as rayon, polyester, nylon, and spandex. And when washed, they may release millions of microscopic fibers into the ocean. In fact, there was this very interesting study that came out a couple years ago showing one load of laundry in a top loading washer released about 3 times as many fibers, and it was still, millions as compared to the front loading. But either way, it still releases a lot of these fibers that end up going into the ocean. And then look for clothing that is made from natural materials such as cotton and silk. I recommend ahimsa silk as much as possible because those silkworms are actually left alone to kind of live out their lives. Linen, which is made from flax, and then wool. Again, that's another one where you want to try to look for humanely raised sheep and humane efforts to shear them. Look for fair trade and regenerative products whenever possible. Fair trade is a global movement made up of a diverse network of producers, companies, consumers, advocates, and organizations that put people and the planet first. And then I also recommend looking into regenerative agriculture produced foods, because it's this amazing system where you have, farming and grazing practices, like very small herds of animals that are able to graze the land and chomp off the very tops of grasses. And they actually can reverse climate change by building up the soil carbon. So it actually pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, stores it in the soil. And there's this great book called Kiss the Ground, and also a documentary with the same title. And it goes into a lot of the details and instructions on how this actually works. It's really remarkable. And I myself was not aware of it until I had really done the research on it. So it results in more soil, healthier soil, and can potentially, do a lot of the work for us of reducing carbon in the atmosphere. And hopefully more and more farmers and the agricultural systems we have in the United States are coming to understand the benefits of this. And then know that you are able to affect more change than you think you can. In fact, the most powerful action that you as an individual can take is to change your eating habits to be more sustainable. This is, in fact, way more impactful and far-reaching than changing all the light bulbs in your house, driving less, or taking shorter showers. In fact, if you are someone who eats a typical standard American diet and then change over to a primarily plant-based diet, you can save the same amount of water that almost fills an Olympic-sized swimming pool in 1 year. So that's huge. Vote for those who believe in climate change and the action that's needed. Seek out fair trade, organic and compostable products. Do your part and advocate and educate those around you as if this were an emergency, because I truly believe that it is. And then some final thoughts and conclusions before I get to the Q&A is to engage with others, encourage them to actively participate in protecting Earth. I like the idea of changing minds one person at a time, even one bite at a time. Take responsibility and do your part. Be more conscious about your decisions and your level of consumption. Pass on the knowledge that you have gained, learn more, read books, watch documentaries, but do not give up hope. There is always one more thing that you can do today. Don't think in all or nothing ways. Do your best and keep going, keep trying. Support organizations that are doing good, and do understand this is a journey. We're not all perfect. We all do our best, and that's what we can ask for. And just know that the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. I really like this quote because in my mind, we all need to be active participants and not think that technology is going to get us out of this or that government will get us out of this. I think we all really need to take responsibility as well and do our part. And then as Dr. Gross mentioned at the beginning, if any of you have any additional questions about it after this lecture, my book is called Recipe for Survival: What You Can Do to Live a Healthier and More Environmentally Friendly Life. All right, so I will stop sharing now. I think we'll start Q&A.
Wonderful. So thanks so much for that. Really, I mean, that's a lot of information to take in. I'm glad we have this recorded so I can go through and kind of pause and pull out some of those notes. So I've got a bunch of questions here. Let's get started with those. So I'll kind of summarize, but also paste them in the chat. So the first question is one I suspect is on many folks' minds. It's about athletes and the kind of particular nutrition needs that appear there. So if you're engaging in rigorous exercise, how does that change kind of your need for protein?
Right. So that's actually a really great question. I guess I want to call myself an amateur athlete. I swim, I run, I cycle. I'm a very, very active person. And, I was a dancer growing up. I've had injuries, and, it's not always about, protein to rebuild things. In fact, our muscles actually thrive. The mitochondria in our cells actually thrive on glucose. That is their primary fuel source. So we do need a certain level of protein every day for rebuilding muscle and tendons and everything else. But the actual fuel source to allow this rebuilding is glucose, and that's why it's important to get enough carbohydrates in the diet. We can't just live on protein. And there have been several studies indicating that, looking at bodybuilders, for example, who are consuming like 3 grams per kilogram of protein per day versus 1 gram per kilogram of protein per day, really there was no difference in the amount of muscle that they were gaining or maintaining. So yeah, exactly. The Game Changers. Yes, that is a great film that goes into a lot of this in detail. Absolutely. And that's true. A lot of us are not nearly as athletic as we think. We do guesstimate how much we're burning as compared to what we are consuming. But with that said, I see a lot of patients in the hospital who they have lost a lot of muscle because of chronic illness or whatever the case may be. And they're taking these supplements with 26 grams of protein per bottle. And they're like, why am I not gaining my strength back? Why am I not putting my weight back on? And I say, because you're not eating enough calories. So it really is, it's a balance of making sure you're getting enough of everything and not just focusing on one thing. In fact, I know the people who did the Game Changers film, they wrote the foreword to my book. Yeah, I know. I see that face. Yeah, so they're really great. It's the Oceanic Preservation Society. They're really great people.
So another question about the possibility of sustainable meat. Is there a way to raise meat in a way that would support the environment?
Right. I think that comes back to the idea of regenerative agriculture. That would also require that a lot of people significantly reduce the amount of meat that they are eating. With regenerative agriculture, the idea is you have a very small herd of grazing cows or buffalo or, whatever the case may be, maybe 100 head or something. And they're grazing, hundreds of acres of land, and they are actually drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. So that, in my mind, is sustainable in terms of raising the animals. That begs the question of the whole slaughter process. And that's another question which wasn't asked in this particular instance, but that's always, comes to my mind as well. But if we're just talking about sustainability, if we look at the idea of regenerative agriculture, which does allow for these grazing animals, yes, that would be sustainable. But as I mentioned, it would also significantly require that pretty much everyone who eats meat would have to reduce the amount of meat they're eating by probably 80 to 90%.
Fantastic. So we still got a whole bunch of questions in the queue here. So the next one is about kind of a greenwashing, really, in particular about biodigesters. Maybe you can explain a little bit what these things are, how they're presented as a solution. And the question is, are they really doing that? Related to this was also a question about sustainable palm oil. Are there certifications that actually are legit that would help that be identified?
Right. Yeah. So when it comes to greenwashing, that, I've seen a lot of that where companies will talk about all of the good that they're doing and try to highlight some of the environmentally friendly things they're doing, or, trying to be carbon neutral. But I don't really feel like there's a lot of transparency when it comes to actually what are they doing? How are they accomplishing this? So I do think that there is a lot of greenwashing that still needs to be fully realized or more transparent. And I think that comes down to, in some places, regulation, and in some places, just demanding more from the companies that we're making purchases from in terms of their transparency to the consumer. And then what was the second question? I'm trying to read through
the part about the biogas and methane digesters.
Oh, yeah, those kind of technologies. I will admit I am not super familiar with those. I haven't done a lot of research on that. So I'm not sure I can really speak to those questions. I think if it's possible that technology can digest, or, the methane that's coming out of landfill or even enteric fermentation, I mean, I'm all for finding technology to help, but I also think that it can't scale up fast enough, given where we are today in the climate scenarios. And I do see a message here about grazed and confused. A large study suggests that cows, that's true, they will. I agree. I think cows will always be net contributors of greenhouse gases. I do completely agree with that. But I think the whole premise of not tilling the soil and keeping those microbes in the soil as opposed to denuding the soils every year, I think is actually the bigger factor in regenerative agriculture than the grazing is. I do completely agree with that statement.
So another question from coming from the director of our Mulvaney Center for Community Awareness and Social Action. Do we see kind of connections here with capitalism?
I think there is. Personally, I believe that there is a lot of issues with capitalism when it comes to sustainability, because I think that we live in a capitalist society. People want to do things that may make their company look better. And so people want to buy more products from their company, or they want to develop technology that they can get a patent on that they can then charge, whatever they want for other companies to use, or for the government to scale up to help with climate change. So I do think capitalism, these were really good questions, by the way. I do think capitalism, right? And I do think living, in a capitalist society is in part a problem when it comes to this. And in terms of population control, I think like in countries like the United States and in other Western countries, population growth is declining, is going down. When you look at developing countries, particularly in Africa, population growth is still increasing. And that's where most of the population growth is going to come from in the next 50 to 80 years. And that then begs the question of like paternalism. Who are we to go to these developing countries and say, oh, you need to have fewer kids? But then that also begs the question of, giving women more access to birth control, more access to education. Having women more educated can make a huge difference in terms of family planning and things of that nature. So, I mean, those are great questions. And, it's really hard, I think, to go into a developing country and say, you can't eat the way we've been eating for the last 50 years, or you can't have so many kids because X, Y, and Z. I think education is a big thing, and there are a lot of other social justice types of issues involved that are probably beyond my scope.
And I think, one part of the question was also just, are you seeing other people making these connections? Is this part of the conversation, or is that, part of the dots that need to be connected? But are you seeing that there's really a robust kind of cross dialogue between these issues, or are we still pretty siloed? I think that was any thoughts on that? And we have other questions to get to, but.
Yeah, I think there is still a lot of silos. I mean, if you go and watch some of these conferences on climate change, 90% of what they're talking about is still reducing emissions from energy or reducing emissions from transport. It has nothing to do with food, and they're eating, a ton of animal products at these conferences. So I think there is still a lot of siloing when it comes to all these issues. And it's interesting on my, Twitter feed, for example, I think a lot of people do mention capitalism. So I've seen a lot of that. Not so much of the population, although I do get asked that from time to time. But overall, I still think there's this big push for changing things at a larger, more economic scale when it comes to emissions, and less of the food systems approach.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know one of the things I think we're really concerned with at the FSI is making these connections across these issues. From our perspective, it's quite siloed, and it seems like one of the things we can potentially do in the conversation. So another question about kind of alternative systems, crickets. This is something I've kind of noticed in the media a little bit more in the last decade or so. Are insect factories in our future? Could they be helpful, not helpful?
Yeah, I think, the idea of eating a cricket to me sounds a little unappealing. I'll just put that out there. I'll be quite honest. I know in many countries, eating insects is totally normal. But yeah, I mean, from a protein source, I think they're a really good source of protein, and they don't require very much in terms of inputs. They're pretty it's like a 1-to-1 ratio, I think, or if not less. But I don't, it's interesting. I think it depends on the reason you're plant-based. For people who are plant-based for the environment, they might consider eating insects or crickets. For people who are plant-based because of animal welfare issues, I don't think so. And for people who are plant-based for health, I'm not really sure what they would do. It's a good question, though.
So here's thank you. I'm just firing them at you. We still got a number before we can just open it up.
Sure.
So this is a question about genetically modified foods. Is that really a factor in climate change, or is that a kind of separate issue?
I think there are a couple ways of looking at genetic modification of foods. There are some ideas that genetic modification of foods has been beneficial for certain populations. For example, if there is, populations that are vitamin A deficient, and this can happen a lot in developing countries, having rice that has a genetic modification to be vitamin A rich can be very beneficial for these groups. However, when it comes to genetic modification, as it's used, I think primarily in the US, where they're modifying these plants to allow for the very liberal use of pesticides and herbicides, I think that is just perpetuating climate change, because a lot of these chemicals are quite detrimental to the environment. So I think it's a nuanced question with varying levels of moral implications, environmental implications, health implications, that it's not super easy to answer. But I know for the companies that are developing GMO, they're getting rich off the backs of a lot of people. So
yeah. Yeah. So another question, I think there was that really remarkable kind of slide you showed with these graphics about just how the biomass of the planet has altered, from most of it being wild animals with this little sliver of human to basically the biomass being reduced to livestock primarily. So this massive reduction in biodiversity, how do you see that kind of or will that be a factor in shaping the human diet in the future? Is that going to force us to alter the kinds of animals we're consuming? Is that going to force us to consume less? What kind of impact do you see of that massive alteration?
Yeah, I think that for the most part, it probably won't necessarily affect, at least in Western cultures, it probably won't affect the human diet a whole lot, because in Western cultures, we primarily eat, a handful of domesticated animals and a handful of domesticated plant foods. But in indigenous cultures, or, in more like in countries where they are reliant more on rain-fed agriculture or the local environment, much more so than we are here, where the growing food is very concentrated among a few players. I do think it will have an effect, because, bushmeat, which is wild animals, may not be nearly as available. And also some of the crops that people gather may not be as available. So I do think there will be negative impacts on people who rely on a lot of this biological diversity for their diet. And again, I think that's primarily indigenous cultures. But I do think, in terms of what issues will that have on the planet as a whole, I see that it could be quite risky. I do see that it could be, do we want the largest land mammal to be a cow, or do we want it to be an elephant? I think, culturally, ethically, I think that will have some moral implications to it, even if it's not dietarily.
Yeah. I mean, it's just this astonishing kind of fact. We got a lot of work to comprehend it. So a question about, and this is the last question I have in the queue, is about resources you would recommend for folks trying to make the change. What are some things to draw our attentions to? And while we're running to the wire, but we should have time for some questions from the floor after you answer that, or I got some if there aren't any that are my own.
So I think, aside from my book, which you can get at a local library or, on the website, whatever the case may be, I think there are a lot of resources out there. One of my favorites is a website called Food 52. They have amazing plant-based recipes. Look in your local, areas for community gardens where you can contribute to some of your own food just from your own, hands and your own energy. Look at maybe some, religious organizations by you. I know there are several religious organizations who focus on a lot of these ethical and environmental issues. For example, Tu B'Shvat in the Jewish religion is all about planting trees and being more sustainable. So I think there are a lot of resources out there. We just have to be, searching for them perhaps, or know what to search for. And also what is, exactly. Plant-based on a budget. I think that would, that's great as well. And the other thing is, a lot of people, I believe, have this misnomer that a plant-based diet costs so much more than a standard American diet, but that's really not the case. And I hate to use the word if you know what you're doing, but it takes practice. It does. I will be completely honest with you. It takes some time. It takes some practice. But once you have gotten into a rhythm, it's easier. You plan ahead and you save so much time during the week, and you can save so much money. We belong to a CSA. We get this huge box of produce every week. It's $20 a week and it lasts us an entire week. We like barely have to even go to the grocery store for produce. Beans, rice, black bean burgers. If you cook in bulk, cook in batches, and then freeze, you can get many, many meals for the same cost as, actually for less of a cost than like a standard American diet. So I do have suggestions about how to do that, again, in the book as well, like meal planning and food shopping and that type of thing, to help with that.
Just got in one more question. Let me put it right in the chat. A question about hope.
Yeah.
What gives you hope? That seems like a great question to reflect on as we close up here.
No, I agree. I'll be honest. When I first started learning about all these issues, I went through a pretty kind of deep depression about it. I cried every day. I would look at my barely, 1-year-old son and I'd say, oh my God, what have we done to this planet? And I didn't have a lot of hope. But the more I learned about it and the more I acted on my concerns and wrote about it and researched what can I do? What is the most impactful thing that I can do as a person to not give up hope and just throw my hands up in the air and say, I can't, I'm just one person, I can't do anything, so why bother trying? I think that gave me hope. And then of course, meeting people like all of you who, are interested in these topics and seeing that there are a lot of people who are interested in these topics and who want to know more and want to know what they can do also gives me hope. So you're not alone in feeling despair or overwhelmed or scared, terrified, numb, whatever you want to, whatever emotion you want to say, you're not alone in feeling that. But there are a lot of people who also want to do a lot of good. And I think if you connect with those people, like I have here, it can make all the difference in the world and it really can give you some hope. It's a great question though.
Thanks so much. And I just, your kind of response there made me think about one of the experiences we had here on campus last semester. Every year we do something called the Changemaker Challenge, where we invite students to actually think about solutions. And this year it dealt with food issues, and the winning kind of solution, which is now in the process of being implemented, was a process of taking cow's milk, which is currently the default for coffee, and making the default option oat milk. You can still order whatever milk you want, but the default is the idea is they're working on changing it to oat milk. And there to the Changemaker Challenge will connect with that. But for me, the experience of watching, there was more than 200 submissions from the campus for different kind of solutions. And, about 10 of us on faculty were judges, and, washing through all of them and seeing the level of energy of at least the students on our campus for thinking about these issues. I genuinely found it inspiring, and it really, it's way more than what I saw when I was in college. So there seems to be a real kind of change underway.